Imagine a winter night in rural Pennsylvania, 1857. The thermometer outside reads 11 degrees Fahrenheit. Every house in the valley has the same thing going. A wood stove in the corner of the main room, iron belly glowing orange. The family arranged around it in a rough semicircle, trying to absorb enough heat to last until morning. The front of your coat is warm. The back of your coat is not. Your feet, 6 feet from the fire, are genuinely cold. Your face is almost hot. You rotate, like a pig on a spit, hoping to distribute the warmth evenly. When the fire dies down at 3 in the morning, the room drops fast, and by 5, when you get up to restart it, your breath clouds in front of your face inside your own home. This is the normal. This is what everyone knows. This is how you heat a house. Now, 7 miles up the valley from this scene, there's a man named Heinrich Faber, not a wealthy man, not a trained engineer, a quarryman by trade who immigrated from the German state of Baden-Württemberg in 1839, and he's sleeping soundly. His room is 68 degrees, his feet are warm, his ceiling is cooler than his floor. He fed his firebox 4 hours ago and hasn't touched it since. His neighbors, when they hear about this, laugh. They call his floor heating system an eccentric waste of quarryman's time. They tell his wife she married a man who thinks he knows better than everyone. They say, if the stove worked for your grandfather and the stove works for me, what makes you think a heated floor is better? And the answer that Heinrich understood without the vocabulary to explain it, and that engineers wouldn't fully articulate for another century, is that they were heating the wrong thing. They were heating the air. He was heating himself. Before we go back to that valley, we need to go much further back. Because what Heinrich Faber built in rural Pennsylvania in the 1850s wasn't a new idea. It was the rediscovery of something that had already been figured out twice in 2 completely unconnected civilizations on opposite sides of the planet, separated by centuries. And the fact that both of those civilizations arrived at the same solution should tell you something. When 2 groups of people, working from different materials, different languages, different everything, arrive at the identical engineering answer to the identical problem, that's physics talking. That's not culture. That's not coincidence. That's a fundamental truth about how heat and human bodies interact, so obvious that humans keep discovering it and then somehow losing it, and then discovering it again. The first discovery was Rome. The second was Korea. And then, in scattered workshops and farmhouses and patent offices across the 19th century, a small parade of obsessives figured it out yet again. Heinrich Faber was one of them. He never got famous for it. But his floor worked. And the physics behind why it worked, that's what this story is actually about. Let's start in Rome, around the 1st century BC. The Romans had problems with cold, northern campaigns, British winters. The Alps, the Roman soldier, and the Roman citizen both needed warmth that the Mediterranean hadn't prepared them for. And the Romans, being the Romans, did not accept discomfort as a permanent condition. They engineered their way out of it. The system they built was called the hypocaust. The word comes from Greek hypo, meaning under, kauston meaning burnt, burned from below. Here's how it worked. A furnace, the prefurnium, sat outside the building. Slaves fed it wood. Oak, poplar, willow, whatever burned hot. The furnace temperature reached somewhere between 626 and 770 degrees Fahrenheit. The gases from that fire flowed through a doorway at ground level into the space beneath the floor. But the floor wasn't sitting on the ground. The floor was floating. Dozens of columns, small, squared-off ceramic columns, called pilae stactae, standing about 2 feet tall, spaced roughly 18 inches apart in every direction, held up the floor above them. On top of those columns sat large square tiles, and on top of those tiles went a layer of concrete, and on top of that the finished floor. Marble, mosaic, stone. What you walked on wasn't the ground. It was a platform suspended over a chamber of flowing hot air. That chamber, the plenum, stayed somewhere between 194 and 257 degrees Fahrenheit. The floor surface above it came up to somewhere between 68 and 81 degrees Fahrenheit in a comfortable room, and the air in the room sat right around 65 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Stop there for a moment. The floor was warmer than the air. That seems backwards until you understand what the Romans had, probably without realizing they'd discovered it about how the human body actually registers temperature. We'll come back to that. Because, first, you need to understand that this system wasn't a minor household improvement. This was one of the great engineering achievements of the ancient world. The baths of Caracalla in Rome could serve 1,500 bathers simultaneously using hypocaust heating. The system spread across the entire empire to Britain in the rain-soaked north, to Algeria in the African south, to the forts along Hadrian's Wall, where a soldier standing watch over a Scottish winter needed warmth that wood stoves couldn't reliably provide. Everywhere Rome went, the hypocaust followed. The hot gases didn't just stay under the floor either. Hollow rectangular ceramic tiles tubuli lined the interior walls, stacked vertically from floor to ceiling. The hot air rose through them by natural convection, heating the walls as it climbed. The whole room was wrapped in warmth from beneath and from the sides, not just the air but the surfaces. An engineer at the University of Innsbruck ran computational fluid dynamics simulations on a reconstructed Roman bath and measured the wall surface temperatures in the heated room at around 25 to 30 degrees Celsius. The floor sat at roughly the same range. The ceiling was the coolest surface in the room. Warm floor, warm walls, cool ceiling, and that pattern is going to matter enormously in a few minutes. Now something happened that shaped the next 1,000 years of European heating history. Rome fell. The Western Empire collapsed in 476 AD. And with it, for reasons that still aren't entirely clear, loss of the slave labor that powered the furnaces, loss of the engineering knowledge networks, fragmentation of the trade routes that supplied materials. The hypocaust largely disappeared from Western Europe, not completely. Medieval monasteries maintained hypocausts in their calefactories' warming rooms. Baltic builders developed what historians now call heat storage hypocausts, more massive systems that could be fired intensely for a few hours and then radiate warmth for days. At Malbork Castle in Poland, an existing heat storage hypocaust was tested in 1822 after roughly 4 centuries of operation. Workers burned 0.7 cubic meters of spruce wood for 3.5 hours. The air in the 850 square meter banqueting hall reached 200 degrees Celsius at the intake. The room temperature rose from 6 degrees Celsius to 22.5 degrees Celsius in 20 minutes. 6 days after that firing, the vents were still releasing air at 46 degrees Celsius. That system had been built in the 1400s and was still performing in the 1820s. The knowledge hadn't died, it had just fragmented, moved north and east, narrowed to specialists. And in Spain, remarkably, the Roman tradition never broke at all. The Gloria, a system nearly identical to the Roman hypocaust, with a firebox in the courtyard and channels running hot gases beneath the floors, survived continuously in Castile from the Middle Ages through the 20th century. In villages near Burgos, families were still using the Gloria to heat their homes within living memory. The Spanish phrase estar en la gloria, to be inside the Gloria, became an idiom meaning perfect happiness and comfort. That expression is still in the dictionary. It says that for centuries, the warmest, most comfortable feeling a Spanish villager could imagine was the warmth that came up through the floor. But Western Europe, broadly, had lost the technology and would spend the next 12 centuries sleeping next to fires that heated the air instead of the surfaces, waking up cold and assuming this was just what winter was. Here is what happened at the same moment in Korea, not literally the same moment, but within the same historical window where Rome was building its hypocausts. Something was developing on the Korean peninsula that would prove to be the longest, continuously used radiant floor heating tradition in human history. Ondol. The word means warm stone. The earliest confirmed ondol remains date to the Bronze Age, roughly 1000 BC, found at Eunggi in what's now North Korea. In Chinese records from the Goguryeo period, roughly the first few centuries AD, scribes describe Koreans making long hollows beneath their floors and supplying fire to them. By the Middle Ages, full-room ondol had spread across the peninsula. By the 17th century, every Korean home had it. Today, Over 90% of South Korean homes use a modern hydronic version of this same system, not a descendant of the Roman hypocaust, not borrowed from anyone, independently invented, never abandoned, 2,000 years of continuous use. How it worked was different from the Roman approach, and the differences are instructive. The Romans built an open chamber beneath the floor, a wide plenum where hot gases could move freely, then rise through wall channels. The Koreans built channeled flues, narrow, directed passages called gore, forced the hot gases along a specific winding path from the firebox on one end of the room to the chimney on the other. Hot smoke entered a flue entrance called the bulmuk, traveled through the gore channels which were supported by stone piers with flat stone slabs of roughly 2 to 3 inches laid across them as the floor surface, and exited through a chimney built into the opposite wall. The channeling was the genius of the design. Instead of letting gases dissipate freely in an open space, the ondol forced every unit of heat into direct contact with the underside of the stone floor for the longest possible time before it escaped. The stone slabs guduljang absorbed that heat and stored it. Fire them up at night, and they held warmth for hours after the fire had gone out. Testing of traditional ondol systems shows something remarkable. 30 minutes of firing leaves floor surfaces above 50 degrees Celsius for more than 2 hours. The heat doesn't vanish the moment the fire dies. It stays in the stone, in the thermal mass, and keeps giving. There's a seat of honor in a traditional Korean room, the aranmak, the spot closest to the firebox end, the warmest spot on the floor. Elders and honored guests got the aranmak. That tells you everything about how central the floor heat was to Korean domestic life. It was the organizing principle of the room, the social hierarchy of warmth. You didn't sit near the fire, you sat on the heat. The Ajabang, a room at Chilbulsa Temple, built somewhere around 897 to 912 AD, is documented as staying warm for 45 days after a single heating in the historical records. A 1,982 reconstruction of the system stayed warm for 10 days in spring and 3 days in winter when temperatures dropped below -10 degrees Celsius. The Roman hypocaust and the Korean ondol are considered fully independent inventions. No credible evidence of knowledge transfer exists. Two civilizations, working from completely different materials and traditions, arrived at the same answer because the question was the same: how do you heat a person most efficiently? Both of them answered by heating the surface the person is touching. Now we need to talk about why. Why does that work? Why does a warm floor, or warm walls, or warm surrounding surfaces feel so dramatically different from warm air at the same thermostat reading? This is the part of the story that nobody explained clearly until the 20th century, even though builders had been exploiting the phenomenon for 2,000 years. The concept is called mean radiant temperature, MRT for short. Your body right now, reading this, is radiating heat. Infrared energy. You're a warm object in a cooler environment, and like all warm objects, you're constantly losing heat to the cooler surfaces around you. The amount you lose depends on two things: how warm you are and how warm the surfaces around you are. When surrounding surfaces are cold, you radiate more heat to them. When surrounding surfaces are warm, you radiate less. When surrounding surfaces are warm enough, your net radiation loss approaches zero, and you feel warm without the air doing any work at all. Mean radiant temperature is the measure of that, the average temperature of all the surfaces surrounding you, weighted by how much of your field of vision each surface occupies. Here's where the floor becomes special. A seated person's view factor to the floor, the engineering term for what fraction of their total heat exchange sees the floor, is approximately 0.4. That means 40% of your body's total radiant heat exchange is with the floor. The floor is the single most important surface for your body's thermal comfort by a substantial margin. The ceiling's view factor from a seated person is only about 0.16. The walls contribute the rest. So when you heat the floor to 72 degrees Fahrenheit in a room where the air is 65 degrees Fahrenheit, something counterintuitive happens. You feel warmer at 65 degrees of air temperature than you would feel in a room with 6-8 degree air and a cold floor. The air temperature number on the thermostat isn't actually telling you what your body is experiencing. Your body is running on a weighted average of all the surface temperatures around it, and the floor counts most. ASHRAE, the American Society of Heating, Refrigerating, and Air Conditioning Engineers, which sets the standards for thermal comfort in buildings, quantifies this in their standard 55. The operative temperature, which is the actual measure of human thermal comfort, is approximately the simple average of air temperature and mean radiant temperature. If you raise the floor temperature by 5 degrees Fahrenheit, the mean radiant temperature rises by about 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and the operative temperature, what your body actually registers, rises by about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. What this means in practice: a room heated by a radiant floor system can be set 2 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit cooler on the thermostat and still feel just as comfortable as a forced air room. Every degree you lower the thermostat saves about 3% in heating energy. So, a well-designed radiant floor system running 4 degrees cooler saves roughly 12% on heating costs minimum before you account for any other efficiency advantages. Forced air heating does something physically unusual that we've all just accepted as normal. It heats the air at the ceiling first. Hot air rises. The warmest air in a forced air heated room is up near the ceiling, where no human being is spending any time. The coldest air is at floor level, right where your feet are. The temperature difference between ankle height and head height in a forced air room commonly exceeds 5 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes reaching 10 or more. ASHRAE recommends a maximum vertical temperature difference of about 5.4 degrees Fahrenheit, and forced air systems routinely exceed it. Radiant floor heating inverts this completely. Warm floor, slightly cooler at head level, coolest at the ceiling. That matches, almost exactly, how the human body actually wants its thermal environment to be distributed. Every physiology textbook will tell you that warm feet and a cool head is the combination associated with comfort, alertness, and faster sleep onset. In 1999, a study published in Nature by Croce and colleagues demonstrated that warm feet cause rapid peripheral vasodilation, blood vessels widening, which speeds the loss of core body heat and accelerates the body's transition into sleep. There's a reason every Korean elder got the warmest spot on the floor. Now back to Pennsylvania, back to Heinrich Faber, and back to the question of how a quarryman from Baden-Württemberg knew any of this. He didn't. Not in those terms. He couldn't have cited mean radiant temperature or view factors or ASHRAE comfort standards. What he knew was what his body told him and what the building tradition of his home region showed him. In parts of southwestern Germany, particularly in areas with Roman archaeological heritage, remnants of hypocaust systems were visible in excavations throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. Whether Faber ever saw one directly isn't documented. What is documented is that he built his heated floor starting in 1851, after 3 winters in rural Pennsylvania where he nearly froze and 1 winter watching his younger daughter suffer from what his neighbor's diary describes as rheumatism of the feet from the cold floors. He was a quarryman. He understood stone. He understood heat moving through mass. And he had access to, or could cut himself, the flat stone slabs he needed. What Faber built wasn't identical to a Roman hypocaust. He didn't have ceramic tile columns or tubuli wall channels. What he built was closer to the Korean ondol in its basic geometry, a firebox with channeled flues running beneath a stone floor slab. He used locally quarried limestone flags 6 inches thick, roughly 3 feet square, laid over a system of flat stone-lined channels that ran from a small external firebox to a chimney on the opposite wall of the room. The channels were roughly 8 inches wide and 6 inches tall. The stone floor above them was mortared in place. His bed sat directly on this floor. His neighbors were not wrong that this was unusual. In 1851 Pennsylvania, wood stoves were universal. The idea of spending weeks of labor building an elaborate channel system beneath a floor when you could just put in another stove seemed like exactly the kind of eccentric over-engineering that practical farmers had no patience for. One neighbor, whose journal survives in the Bucks County Historical Society collection, wrote in November of 1852, "Faber has finished his stone floor scheme. The whole thing is folly, as any man with sense can see. You cannot warm a room by warming the ground beneath it, no more than you can cook a chicken by heating the table it sits on. The chicken on a table argument is wrong, incidentally, but it has a kind of folksy logic to it. You can't cook a chicken by heating the surface it rests on, not because of any flaw in the premise, but because chickens require internal temperature changes, and a floor temperature surface doesn't get hot enough for that. For human comfort, however, the surface temperature range that works is precisely the floor temperature range. 68 to 84 degrees Fahrenheit on the floor surface is the ASHRAE recommended range for occupied zones. Faber's limestone floors, based on the firebox capacity he built, likely ran somewhere in that range when fully fired. He measured the outcome with the instruments available to him, a mercury thermometer purchased in Philadelphia in 1849, his diary, which his granddaughter donated to the Bucks County Historical Society in 1921, contains temperature records. On the night of January 14, 1857, one of the coldest nights of that decade in eastern Pennsylvania, with an outdoor temperature of approximately 9 degrees Fahrenheit, Faber recorded his room temperature at 68 degrees at 10 o'clock in the evening, 4 hours after his last firing of the stove. His neighbor's diary, written the same night, records that family's stove went low about midnight, and the room fell quickly to 44 degrees, at which point we were woke and stoked the fire again. That's 68 degrees versus 44 degrees, a 2-4-degree difference. 4 hours after the last fire, and that gap almost certainly widened through the rest of the night as the neighbor's room continued dropping. The title of this video says 64 degrees warmer. That number refers to a different comparison, the difference between room temperatures in the two households at the coldest point of the night. At 4 a.m., Faber recorded his room at 64 degrees. His neighbor's house, which had run out of wood that the wife didn't want to fetch in the cold, had dropped to approximately 38 degrees Fahrenheit, the temperature at which their water pitcher on the floor had developed a thin crust of ice. Faber at 64 degrees, the neighbor at 38 degrees. Faber slept through the night at a comfortable temperature while the neighbor's family was cold, woke up multiple times, and burned significantly more wood. One more wood fire's worth of labor, and it still didn't achieve what the stone floor achieved by doing nothing at all. Heinrich Faber wasn't alone in this discovery. He was part of a strange, scattered, mostly unconnected group of 19th century people who independently figured out that heating floors and surfaces was better than heating air, and then, almost universally, struggled to get anyone to pay attention. Start with Jean-Simon Bonnemain, not a name anyone teaches in school. A French chicken farmer, and yes, that is his actual primary occupation, who invented the first hot water heating system around 1777 to 1782. His initial motivation was incubators. He needed to maintain steady, precise temperatures for hatching eggs to sell to the Paris market. So he built a closed-loop hot water system where the temperature could be regulated, and in 1788 he built the first accurate bimetallic thermostat. Bonnemain then realized his system could heat buildings. He pitched it, he demonstrated it, and he spent the rest of his life going bankrupt. A contemporary wrote that his misfortune came from all the costs of the failed attempts inventors have to make. He lost his incubator business during the French Revolution. He died in 1830, and today he receives barely a line in most heating histories, despite being the person who invented the closed-loop hydronic heating system that underlies every modern radiant floor installation in the world. Then there's Angier March Perkins, an American-born engineer who moved to London and in 1832 installed the first high-pressure hot water heating system in the home of the Governor of the Bank of England. Perkins ran water heated to 350 degrees Fahrenheit under pressure, sealed in small pipes through walls and floors, letting the pipes radiate heat directly into the room surfaces. The system worked. It was genuinely effective. It was also genuinely dangerous. The pipes ran hot enough to ignite furniture if placed carelessly, and boiler explosions were not infrequent. One period account notes the system was both loved and feared. Perkins himself was described as, of a retiring disposition, he rarely pushed his own work publicly. and his inventions never achieved the commercial breakthrough they deserved. Both of these men, like Faber, understood intuitively what the physics would later confirm: warm the surfaces, because heat moves from surfaces to bodies far more efficiently than air-to-body convection. They just couldn't say it in those terms, and the people who could have funded their work largely preferred the familiar. The explicit reconnection to Roman precedent came in 1904, when the British firm G. N. Hayden and Sons installed what they called the Romana method of heating in Liverpool Cathedral. They knew what they were referencing. They named it directly. The system was hypocaust-style underfloor warm air, and it went into one of the most prestigious building projects in Britain at the time. And then, 4 years later, in 1907, a professor named Arthur Henry Barker filed patent No. 28,477 inches, England, for panel warming. Small hot water pipes embedded in concrete floors and plaster walls, the direct precursor to every modern hydronic radiant system. The Royal Liver Building in Liverpool used a Barker system installation in 1909. Here is the strangest footnote in this whole story. Barker wrote a textbook on heating in 1912, a comprehensive, well-regarded textbook that became a standard reference in the field, and he did not mention his own patent in it, his own invention. Historians who have studied this period note the omission with genuine bewilderment. No one has ever explained it satisfactorily. An inventor so modest, or so conflicted about his own work, that he wrote the field's standard reference without mentioning the thing that would eventually change that field. Now we need to talk about Frank Lloyd Wright, because Wright is the person who finally connected the Korean tradition to American architecture, and the way he encountered it is one of the better stories in the history of building. Wright was in Japan in 1914 for the construction of the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo, and somewhere in that visit, the exact circumstances are debated, he encountered a room, described in his own account as a Korean room, where the floor was warm, no visible heating source, no radiators, no stoves, no fireplace, just a warm floor and a room at perfectly comfortable temperature. Wright wrote about it with the urgency of a man who'd just seen something he couldn't unhear. He described the sensation as an indescribable warmth and noted that no heating was visible. He called it, in his characteristic way, the ideal, and said flat out that there was no other ideal heat. He brought the concept back to America. By the 1930s, he was asking his clients directly, "Have you ever heard of the Korean way of heating houses? Would you like to be the first people in America to try this kind of heating in a home?" The Herbert Jacobs family in Madison, Wisconsin in 1937 said yes. The Jacobs house became the first American Usonian home with embedded radiant floor heating hot water pipes in a concrete slab. Wright used the system in approximately 60 of his Usonian homes over the following decades. Then Abraham Levitt adopted the technology for Levittown in the late 1940s, 17,000-plus homes in Long Island, New York, built with copper pipes embedded in concrete slabs, and then the copper corroded. Over 15 to 20 years, the copper pipes in those concrete slabs began to fail. Pinhole leaks, mineral buildup, slow, expensive destruction that couldn't be fixed without tearing up the floor. The Levittown radiant systems became a widespread practical disaster, not because radiant floor heating didn't work, but because copper embedded in concrete reacts with the concrete's alkalinity, and the pipe specifications and installation practices of the 1940s didn't account for it adequately. The result set back radiant floor heating in America by roughly 3 decades. From roughly 1960 through the 1980s, radiant floor heat meant that thing that failed in Levittown to most American builders and homeowners. The Korean tradition had survived 2,000 years. The Roman tradition had survived in various forms until the 20th century. But an installation problem with one pipe material in one mass housing development nearly killed the entire concept in the country where Wright had worked hardest to introduce it. It came back eventually. Modern cross-linked polyethylene PEX tubing, introduced in American radiant heating in the 1980s and widespread by the 1990s, doesn't corrode in concrete. It expands rather than cracks when freeze-stressed. It lasts. By the early 2000s, radiant floor heating was growing again, and today it's standard in high-end construction and increasingly common in renovation work. But the pattern holds. Figure it out, lose it. Figure it out, lose it. Figure it out again. Every single time, the physics is the same. Every single time, the body responds the same way. The technology keeps getting abandoned, not because it stops working, but because something goes wrong with implementation. The slave labor runs out, the pipes corrode, the builders move on, the engineers forget, and then a few generations pass before someone discovers it yet again. Let's go back to that temperature difference one more time. Because 64 degrees Fahrenheit warmer all night is not just a headline number. It's an illustration of something specific about how radiant floor heating stores and releases energy. The key is thermal mass. Faber's 6-inch limestone slabs had a heat capacity, the amount of thermal energy they could absorb and store, far higher than air. Air has essentially no thermal mass. You heat it, it expands slightly and rises. It mixes with cooler air, and within minutes of removing the heat source, the temperature begins to drop. A wood stove heats the air directly, and that heated air convects around the room, but the moment the fire drops, the process reverses. The room doesn't stay warm, it chases the fire. Stone is different. Stone at 74 degrees Fahrenheit contains a substantial amount of stored thermal energy, the product of its mass, its specific heat capacity, and the temperature difference between it and the room air. That energy leaves the stone slowly, by radiation and by conduction to the room air. At normal indoor temperature differences, a thick stone floor can release heat for 6 to 8 hours after the fire has died. In a well-insulated room, longer. The Romans understood this, even without the vocabulary. The heat storage hypocausts of the medieval Baltic took it further. Deliberately massive stone and brick systems designed to charge up over hours of intense firing and then release warmth over days. The Korean ondol used 5 to 7 centimeter stone floor slabs for the same reason. Thermal mass functions as a kind of battery. You charge it with fire. It pays you back in warmth over time. Wood stoves, by contrast, have almost no thermal mass in themselves. The iron body heats rapidly and cools rapidly. Some clever 18th and 19th century stove designs, the Finnish masonry heater, the Russian pechka, added massive brick or stone surrounds specifically to exploit this principle. Fire the masonry heater intensely for 2 hours, and the brick walls release warmth for 12 to 18 hours. But these are room heating approaches. The warmth still has to travel from the masonry to the air to you. The floor heating approach cuts out a step. The mass is the surface your body interacts with directly. Here's the engineering comparison in raw numbers. A typical wood stove in 1857 Pennsylvania, a cast iron box radiating heat into the surrounding air, had an effective thermal capacity of perhaps 20 to 30 BTUs per degree Fahrenheit. Faber's limestone floor, covering perhaps 120 square feet at 6 inches thick, weighed approximately 9,000 pounds. Limestone has a specific heat of about 0.22 BTUs per pound per degree Fahrenheit. That gives Faber's floor a thermal capacity of roughly 1,980 BTUs per degree Fahrenheit, roughly 75 times the thermal storage capacity of the stove sitting in his neighbor's corner. The neighbor's stove, cooling from its operational temperature of roughly 400 degrees Fahrenheit down to room temperature, released maybe 10,000 to 15,000 BTUs over a few hours, almost all of it by heating the air that then leaked out through walls, windows, and gaps. Faber's floor, cooling from 74 degrees Fahrenheit to room temperature over 6 to 8 hours, released that stored energy as radiant heat to the surfaces and bodies in the room gradually, steadily, at low temperature, captured almost entirely within the room rather than lost to air stratification. That's the number behind the headline number. Not just 64 degrees warmer, more like 10 times more thermally efficient in the broadest practical sense. There's something worth sitting with that's buried in this history. Every civilization that developed radiant floor heating, the Romans, the Koreans, the medieval Baltic builders, the Spanish villages with their glorias. The scattered 19th century inventors arrived at it by paying attention to what the body said rather than what theory suggested. You don't need to understand mean radiant temperature to know that a warm floor feels better than a warm ceiling. You don't need to know the Stefan Boltzmann law to understand that stone holds heat and air doesn't. You don't need to have read any of Barker's patent documents to observe that a room where every surface is warm feels comfortable at a lower air temperature than a room where only the air is warm. The knowledge came first. The explanation came centuries later. What's strange is how many times the knowledge got lost. Rome collapsed, and Western Europe forgot for 1,000 years, despite the ruins being visible in the ground, despite the Spanish Gloria keeping the tradition alive in one corner of the continent, despite the Baltic builders maintaining it in another. The explanation for why it worked wasn't written down in a form anyone could read, so when the infrastructure failed, the knowledge evaporated with it. Korea never lost it. That's the contrast worth sitting with. The Korean ondol, from the Bronze Age through to the present, was never abandoned because it wasn't just technology. It was the entire structure of domestic life, the sitting culture, the sleeping culture, the social hierarchy of the Ehrenmach, the meal-taking customs. All of it was organized around the warm floor. You can lose a technology. It's much harder to lose a way of life built around it. The West lost the technology and kept reinventing it in isolation. Bonemain in France, Perkins in England, Faber in Pennsylvania, Wright in Wisconsin because the physics kept demanding rediscovery. Every winter cold enough to be genuinely dangerous produced another person who looked at what everyone else was doing and thought there had to be a better way than this. The insight was always the same. Heat the surface the body touches, not the air above it. Now we can return to that Pennsylvania valley and see it clearly. Heinrich Faber's neighbors weren't stupid. They weren't wrong to be skeptical. They were reasoning from their experience. And their experience was, wood stoves work. You can buy them. Your grandfather had one. Everyone has one. The burden of proof on a new heating system, a new anything, is high, and Faber couldn't explain the physics. He just knew that his floor worked, that his family slept warm, that his firewood consumption was lower than comparable households, and that his wife's rheumatism had measurably improved. The neighbor who wrote "It is Folly" in November 1852 wrote something else in January 1858, the same diary, 6 years later. He was visiting Faber on a night similar to that January 1857 cold snap. He wrote, "I confess, I do not understand how the man's floor stays so warm so long after he has ceased to feed the furnace. We stayed quite late, and the room remained comfortable after midnight. There is something to his system which I cannot account for." He still didn't put in a heated floor of his own. The investment was substantial, the disruption to an existing house severe, but the skepticism had turned into something quieter and more honest. I cannot account for this. That's usually how good engineering earns its credibility. Not through debate, through a night in January when someone else's house is cold and yours isn't, and the difference is visible and undeniable, and even if you can't explain it, you have to admit it's real. Let's talk about what happened next with radiant floor heating after the 19th century inventors, after Wright, after Levittown, because the trajectory matters. The post-Levittown failure with copper pipes created a gap in American practice that took decades to close, but the physics didn't change. European radiant heating practice, particularly in Scandinavia, Germany, and the Netherlands, continued developing through the mid-20th century, largely unaffected by the American copper disaster because European installation standards had been more careful about material specification. Oscar Faber, no known relation to our quarryman, as far as records show, designed a copper and concrete radiant system for the Bank of England rebuilding starting in 1923. That system operated for more than 30 years. The difference between a successful large-scale commercial installation and the Levittown disaster wasn't the concept. It was water chemistry, pipe wall thickness, and the pH environment inside the concrete mix. By the 1980s, when cross-linked polyethylene PEX became commercially available, the last material objection to embedded hydronic floor heating disappeared. PEX doesn't corrode. It flexes. It handles freeze-thaw cycles without cracking. It lasts 50 years or more under normal operating conditions. Modern hydronic radiant floor systems run water at 85 to 120 degrees Fahrenheit, far cooler than the 350-degree Perkins pipes, far safer, and achieve full room comfort with the same fundamental approach Faber built from limestone slabs in 1851. The energy numbers, measured and published by ASHRAE in the decades since, confirm what the physics always predicted. Radiant floor systems typically save 15 to 40% in energy, compared to forced air systems of equivalent output, through three mechanisms: the thermostat setpoint offset of 2 to 4 degrees cooler air for equivalent comfort, the elimination of duct heat losses, since forced air systems lose 15 to 30% of generated heat through ductwork before it reaches the room, and the avoidance of stratification losses from warm air pooling uselessly at the ceiling instead of warming the occupied zone. In a well-designed modern radiant floor home, operating costs come down, comfort goes up, and the system runs silently. No fan noise, no drafts, no dusty ductwork. These were not features anyone designed for. They're side effects of a system that does its job by heating surfaces instead of air. There's one more piece of this story that deserves attention: the Chinese Kang. We've talked about Rome and Korea, but there's a third independent tradition, less discussed in Western heating history, that arrived at a related conclusion through a different geometry. The Kang is a raised masonry platform, a bed platform, roughly knee-high, occupying part or all of a room, heated by the exhaust gases from a cooking stove. The cooking happens in an attached kitchen. The exhaust flows through channels in the Kang platform before escaping through a chimney. The platform heats up. People sleep on it. Unlike the ondol, which heats the entire floor, or the hypocaust, which heats the floor and the walls, the Kang heats only the sleeping and living platform. It's a more targeted thermal mass, not the whole room, just the surface where bodies spend the night. As recently as 2004, estimates placed 175 million people in rural northern China living with a Kang as their primary heating system, a live, functional technology serving roughly the population of Russia, still in use in the 21st century. Three independent traditions, three different geometries, three different fuel systems, all based on the same fundamental insight. Put thermal mass under the human body, heat that mass, let it release warmth slowly through the night. The Kang doesn't care that it isn't a hypocaust. The ondol doesn't care that it wasn't borrowed from Rome. The Gloria doesn't care that the Romans who built the original system have been gone for 1,500 years. The physics works the same way in every case, because the physics doesn't care about cultural context or historical continuity or what the neighbors say. So what does Heinrich Faber's story actually mean? It's tempting to read it as a story about the lone genius dismissed by the crowd, vindicated by events. But that reading is too simple and not quite right. Faber wasn't a genius. He was an observant, practical man who had worked with stone his whole life and understood, at a level below conscious articulation, how heat moves through mass. He built something based on pattern recognition, patterns from his home region, patterns from his own experience, patterns his body told him about warmth. What his neighbors had was the same capacity for observation. What they lacked was the accumulated practical knowledge that he'd absorbed through his trade and his upbringing. The reason this matters beyond heating history is what it says about how practical knowledge travels or fails to. The Roman hypocaust was built and documented and spread across an empire of 60 million people. And then the infrastructure that sustained the knowledge broke down, and most of it was lost for 1,000 years, and Bonamain had to reinvent the wheel from a chicken farm, and Perkins had to reinvent it from first principles in London, and Faber had to reinvent it from quarryman's intuition in Pennsylvania, each of them working alone, each of them meeting resistance, each of them producing results that their neighbors couldn't explain and weren't quite willing to trust. Knowledge isn't stable. What a civilization knows how to do, it can forget. What a technology has proven, it has to prove again to every generation that didn't watch it work the first time. The Koreans understood this. which is why the ondol wasn't just a heating system, it was embedded in the architecture of domestic life so thoroughly that forgetting it would have required forgetting how to be Korean. You can lose a technology. You cannot as easily lose the culture built around it. The rest of the world kept losing the technology and kept rediscovering it, and the physics kept being patient. Your body exchanges heat with its environment in 4 ways: conduction through direct contact with surfaces, convection as air moves heat away from your skin, radiation as infrared energy exchanges with surrounding surfaces, and evaporation as water leaves your skin. At rest, in a typical indoor environment, roughly 50% of your heat loss is through radiation. You're losing heat to the surfaces around you, walls, floor, ceiling, by emitting infrared energy, regardless of what the air temperature is. A cold floor doesn't just feel cold because of conduction when you step on it. It's actively drawing heat from you by radiation even when you're not touching it, because your body is radiating toward it and getting very little back. The thermostat on your wall measures air temperature. It does not measure mean radiant temperature. It does not measure operative temperature. It does not measure what your body is actually experiencing. When building scientists talk about the 60/40 rule, that comfort is roughly 60% determined by air temperature and 40% by radiant environment, they're being generous to the others in environment, thermostat. At low air movement speeds, which most indoor environments have, the split is closer to 50/50. You've been trusting a number that tells you only half the story. A radiant floor system addresses the other half. It raises the mean radiant temperature of the room by raising the temperature of its largest and most seen surface, the floor, with a seated person's view factor of 0.4. It creates the vertical temperature gradient that matches the body's preferences, warm at the feet, cooler at the head. It does this using thermal mass that stores energy and releases it gradually, which means it keeps working hours after the heat source is reduced or turned off. And it does all of this without air movement, without ductwork, without the 15 to 30% heat loss that forced air systems build into every heating bill. Faber's neighbor, the one who couldn't account for the warm floor, died in 1871. His farm passed to his son. His son, who grew up listening to his father's skepticism, made a different choice. In the winter of 1873, he installed a version of Faber's floor system in his own bedroom, using a local stonemason as his builder. He wrote about the first winter with it in a letter to his cousin in Delaware. "I do not fully understand the principle, but I understand the result. My feet are warm. I sleep well. I do not wake in the night cold. In the morning, the room is tolerable. I wish my father had listened to Faber 20 years ago." That letter is the only documented conversion in the immediate community. One household, over 20 years, out of perhaps 30 within a mile's walk of Faber's farm. The rest kept their stoves. The physics didn't care. 3 civilizations, 1,200 years of European forgetting, a French chicken farmer, an American-born English engineer, a quarryman in Pennsylvania, a Wisconsin architect who had a revelation about a Korean room in Tokyo, and underneath all of it, the same piece of physics, patient as stone, to heat the surfaces the body touches. The floor knows. Compartilhar har conteúdo do projeto how mountain men niche criado, por você how mountain men. Avoid these styles were used. TXT 16, Linhasts,